What are shadow people? In a number of my books I have mentioned in the past that growing up I was fortunate enough to have many paranormal experiences. I mentioned that these experiences were largely, most likely completely, related to my great-grandmother, who seemed to have this ability to manipulate the world around her, in ways that were and still are beyond rational contemplation. Quite simply, the house where I lived in as a child with my grandmother and great-grandmother was quite literally a hotbed of paranormal activity. Glowing lights and orbs of all kinds were quite natural, and everyone in the family had experience in seeing them. Apparitions of all sorts would happen all the time, and many ghost-like entities made regular visits to that home. There were also many occurrences of physical objects being teleported from one location to another, sometimes of quite large things. And this also included psychokinetic activity, the movement of all sorts of matter, right before our eyes, that baffled us and terrified me in particular. In this video, I would like to discuss the general nature of what are referred to as shadow people. And I mention my grandmother's house, because among the many other phenomena experienced by the entire family in this house, many of us would also see shadow people from time to time. In this video then, I would like to share a particular experience that I had, to give a general example that many people who have experienced these shadow entities may identify with, and to use this experience as a backdrop to discuss what these beings are and what their purposes can be on certain occasions. Now, that being said, there are a great range of purposes and possibilities when it comes to the shadow people, meaning that not all shadow people are created equal, as it were. Some of them are quite simply beings that are in the wrong place at the wrong time, in the same way that a human being might be at the wrong place, and whisked or slightly moved to another dimension. Such accidental encounters are far more common than some would imagine. In other words, we can actually be shadow people to other beings existing in other dimensions, when these accidental shifts happen. Other beings perceived as shadow people by us here in this dimension, are beings that live in a more flowing state, a more etheric and open-ended dimension. These dimensions are more open-ended, meaning that to move dimensionally in and out of them is far easier than this one. Such dimensions can be very similar to what may be experienced in dreams, for example. In such dreamlike dimensions, aware entities native to that zone consider such movement and encounters, from one dimension to the other, quite normal, and as such they are either active participants in the act of crossing between dimensions, or they may simply peer into these new dimensional locations when they happen, in the same way that a tourist might look out the window of a tour bus. These kinds of entities are usually quite used to a kind of window or portal opening up in and around them, and may use such opportunities to view new and strange realms, or may even try to make limited contact with the strange new creatures that they may witness. For us, of course, such dimensional shifts, while far more common than most people suppose, are always surprising and generally quite terrifying. Certainly in my youth they were quite terrifying to me. The point that I'm trying to make is that not all shadow people are created equal, and there are different intents and purposes behind such encounters. Some of these encounters may be quite benign, like the one that I'm going to share with you, while there are others that are far more predatory in nature, and involve a more concerted effort to malevolently profit in one way or another from the situation. The particular experience that I want to discuss here, I think provides a good general example of what most people see when they encounter shadow people, and may relate to something that you may have experienced yourself, if you have been fortunate, or unfortunate enough, to run into one of these shadow entities. This particular experience happened when I was quite young, but I remember it very well, as it was a very traumatic experience for me at the time. As was usual of most of the more terrifying experiences that I had while in my grandmother's house, I found myself alone in one particular wing. It was a bright sunny day outside, and the entire family was outside in the patio while, after some general merriment on my part, I got a little tired and cranky, and was told by my mother that perhaps I needed to take a nap. My grandmother's room was the coolest in temperature and closest to the patio, so I decided to go in there and lie on her bed to take my nap. This was an average-sized room, and it had a wonderful big window that allowed the light to come in from the patio. The curtains were drawn, but the brightness of the sun was such that on the opposite wall to the window there was a kind of curtain of light, as the sun streamed in through the window, and the cracks along the edges of it. The window curtains provided enough shade though, that it was relatively dark and quiet in there, so I lay down and quite unconsciously fixated on this panel of light created on the opposite wall. As I lay there in bed and began to relax more and more, I was further transfixed by the fact that this curtain of light would move, seemed to shimmer, and I realized that this movement was most likely the movement of my family outside, as they crossed the patio back and forth. At least that was what I told myself at the time. I satisfied myself with the rationale of this assumption, and began to relax more and more, while my attention focused lightly but intently on the shimmering light on the opposing wall. In time though, to my growing surprise, I did begin to notice that this shimmering began to attain a type of coherence. It was not just streaks of light, and the movement that I had attributed to my family outside in the patio just did not seem to quite coincide with what I was seeing in this cascade of light on the wall. The moment that I realized in a fundamental way that this movement of light did not coincide with the movement of my family out in the patio, there seemed to be a kind of shift within me which was mirrored by a shift in the curtain of light that I had been staring at. What happened was that this light, this chaotic confluence of shimmering light, suddenly became far too coherent for my liking, and those shimmers of light turned into shapes. They actually turned into shadows of light, and further, those shadows of light were not just any kind of shadow, they were shadow people made out of light. While startling at first, this was also quite intriguing to me, and I did not move from my lying down position, and I just kept staring at these newly formed people on the wall. At first I once again thought that the shadows, these shadows of light, were actually somehow the shadows of my family outside. With that mindset I kept on looking at this strange event before me, until I had another realization. The same earlier realization seemed to grip me one more time, and that was that the movement of these light shadows was not the same as the movement of my family in the patio. I had another shock, and my system seemed to do another contraction, another slight alteration in my awareness point, and when this happened, the shadow people seemed to notice me, and whatever it was that they were doing beyond that window that was the shimmering cascade of light, they stopped. They stopped, and they turned quite deliberately, and they looked at me. The moment that this happened I yelled and ran from the bed. As I did so the people on the wall reacted. They turned and they looked at me and followed my movement across the room, as I desperately tried to cross the room as quickly as I could and open the door that led to the outer hall and the patio. To my horror, these people turned towards me even more, and began to move in my direction. They seemed to be reaching out, and as I look back on it I now think that there was an amused quality to them. This idea permeates my memory of it now, this feeling that they were somehow both highly intrigued by me, and what I was doing, and at the same time deeply amused by my horror, and my frantic action. Eventually in my panic, I was able to open the door, and ran like a bullet to my grandmother and great-grandmother. By that time everyone was used to the shenanigans of the house, but my grandmothers, as usual, took immediate action by moving quickly into the room, and confronting and banishing whatever had been conjured in the house's latest little outburst. In a future video or book, perhaps I will go into such shenanigans, and the countering of such forces by them in more detail. For now I will leave it at that, being that in this video anyway, I wish to discuss the shadow entities, and use this example in order to highlight one of the many ways that the shadow people may become manifest in people's lives. This case, for example, shows what I believe to be the most common scenario when there is a crossroads-like meeting between us and such shadow entities. The house that I lived in was an incredibly charged place. What I mean by this is that there was an incredible amount of psychic energy within this building, due to the great power that my great-grandmother had. There are many such places that are either charged naturally because they are structures that have been erected over power spots, or because one of the residents of that place had or has a great deal of psychic energy themselves. In those places, it is far more common to see these windows open up between dimensions, And it is even sometimes the case that people that might not be incredibly psychically powerful may have enough power to tip the scales and allow such windows to open up, due to the fact that there's already such an incredibly large psychic charge present. This is what I now know happened to me, as I lay there and focused my attention on the shimmering light. The already existing power of the place combined with my young and highly flexible child's awareness. This was enough to open a window, so that as I relaxed more and more, perhaps even entering a mild trance state, my awareness was enough to solidify a quite real window, thankfully not a door, but a window, into another dimensional place, another dimensional location. That location was not a deserted place. There were other beings there, other very real and very humanoid-looking beings. When this window opened up, when this window attained a certain level of materialization and stability, I was able to see them clearly, and by that token they were able to see me clearly as well. And while I was absolutely terrified by this encounter, they seemed amused and instantly began to interact with me without any reservations. So what we have here then is a power location, usually a human being with a flexible awareness, a shifting of that awareness point within the human being, in my case through my deep relaxation, and the fact that I was a child with a flexible awareness, and in many cases a point of fixation for that awareness like a contrasting point of lightness or darkness within an already darkened or twilight environment. While this was a relatively friendly encounter in many ways, the far more frightening and predatory encounters seem to take the same general format. That is, you have a power location that may have attained this power through some kind of misery or horrible expenditure of psychic energy within this area. You have a person in this space who through sheer fright within the location develops a more flexible awareness, being that extreme fear can cause a loosening within the awareness of a person, and usually again a contrasting point between light and darkness, being that all such encounters usually happen in a twilight-like environment where even a semblance of contrast can be found. And the reason why most of these beings seem to be shadows, or two-dimensional in that sense, is that while the awareness of the individual experiencing this phenomena becomes more flexible, it is still usually not flexible enough to see the complete window for what it is, a true rift in space-time, and for that reason what is usually seen as a bit of a bastardization of what is actually going on. In other words, instead of seeing the complete picture of this rift, the human mind can only allow for a two-dimensional shadow to be perceived and assembled, a two-dimensional vision, like these shadow creatures stuck on a wall. And yes, there are cases when such rifts do allow such shadow beings to enter into our dimension. There indeed seems to be certain entities that are looking for these windows to open up, again caused by both their efforts on their side of this dimensional rift or window, and the oftentimes accidental human combination of a power spot and a flexible mind within a twilight environment. Once this window is created, these more predatory type shadow beings may try to enter, and once on this side of the dimensional portal they may then engage in predatory activities, such as trying to frighten a human being and draining that person of that spent psychic force, with as much intensity as is possible for them before that dimensional rift closes once again. This is a very general overview of shadow entities, but I think it provides a good basic snapshot of what we are dealing with when we encounter these beings. If you would like to have a more in-depth look into the flexibility of awareness, and how to develop that flexibility in a controlled manner yourself, I recommend the book, The Occult Experience. If you would like to know more about how to deal with these entities directly, to thwart them, and how to even control your own expulsion of psychic energy, which these beings use to help maintain the dimensional windows created, and to feed themselves and grow in power, I would recommend the book, The Vampire's Way to Psychic Self-Defense.